A man who never raises his voice in an argument is either the calmest person in the room or the most dangerous one. Elliot Reeves had spent 41 years being mistaken for the former. He was a structural engineer by trade, the kind of man who could look at a building's bones and tell you exactly where the stress was concentrated, where the invisible cracks were forming before anything showed on the surface. He had that same quality with people, that same patient, observational stillness. He noticed everything. He said very little. And for 11 years of marriage to Priscilla Reeves, that silence had been treated as evidence of limitation. She called it being checked out. Her friends called it passivity. Her mother, who had opinions about everything and the availability to share them, called it a lack of ambition. What none of them understood was that Elliot was building something. They just hadn't thought to look. The evening it finally broke open was a Tuesday in November. Cold front moving through Houston, the kind that drops 20 degrees in 3 hours and leaves the air smelling like wet concrete and distant rain. Elliot had been on a job site in Midtown since 6 in the morning, an 11-story mixed-use development on Louisiana Street that his firm had been contracted to inspect after the original structural team filed incomplete load calculations. It was detailed, methodical work, the kind most people find unglamorous. Elliot found it satisfying in the way that honest, necessary things are satisfying. He came home at 7:15 to the smell of her perfume in the entryway. That particular one, the expensive French one she saved for occasions she considered significant. Priscilla stood in the kitchen doorway in a black wrap dress, heels already on, hair done. Behind her at the kitchen island sat a man Elliot recognized as Gavin Mercer, 32, junior partner at the architecture firm that had worked on her company's last 2 office renovations. Gavin had the look of a man who had been told he was exceptional so consistently that he had stopped questioning it. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Priscilla turned toward Elliot the way you turn toward background noise. "We're heading to the Barrett Foundation Gala in an hour," she said. "I didn't think you'd want to come. You never do." "You didn't ask," Elliot said. She tilted her head slightly, the small, practiced gesture that meant she found something faintly tedious. "Elliot, it's a black tie fundraiser for urban architecture and civic development. You'd be miserable." She glanced at his work jacket, the dried mud along the hem from the site visit. "Besides, you're not exactly dressed for it." Gavin said nothing. He had the careful neutrality of a man who had done this before and knew better than to draw attention to himself at the wrong moment. "I'll see you later," Priscilla said. She adjusted her earring in the hallway mirror and picked up her clutch. "Don't wait up. These things run late." The door closed. Elliot stood in the entryway for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside. He was not surprised exactly. Surprise requires uncertainty. What he felt was something quieter and more specific. The cold, precise sensation of a thing you have been watching approach finally arriving. He set his bag down, walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink. Then he looked at the window above the faucet, at his own reflection in the dark glass. He thought about Thomas Reeves, his father, a man who had poured concrete for 30 years in Beaumont, Texas, and built a life with his hands that held more integrity than most people manage, with an entire professional vocabulary dedicated to the concept. Thomas had told his son something once, sitting on the back porch of their house on Harriet Street, watching the light go flat on a summer evening. "The people who talk the most about what they deserve," Thomas said, "are usually the ones doing the least work to earn it." Elliot had carried that for 20 years. He carried it now. He went upstairs, showered, and opened the closet. The charcoal suit had been there since September. He'd picked it up from the tailor on Westheimer Road, told no one, left it hanging in the back behind the winter coats, in the way that men keep things they intend to use exactly once, at exactly the right moment. He dressed without hurry, checked the simple watch his father had left him, went downstairs, walked to the garage, and removed the cloth cover from a car that had been parked there for 8 months without Priscilla ever asking about it. Because Priscilla did not ask about things that did not register on the scale she used to measure what mattered. He drove downtown. The Barrett Foundation Gala was held at the Julia Idison Building on McKinney Street, a venue with the kind of architectural dignity that reminds you immediately of the difference between things built to impress and things built to last. Elliot had always liked that building. He'd written about it in a paper during his graduate work at Rice. It had good bones. He arrived at 8:45. What Priscilla had told people at dinner parties when the subject of her husband came up was something along these lines. Elliot is steady, dependable, salt of the earth, really. He inspects buildings for a living. Important work, obviously, but not very. She would pause here, in the way people pause when they want you to fill in the blank for them. He's just not someone who moves in these circles. Psychologists have a term for this: benevolent undermining. It operates through praise carefully chosen to diminish. Not cruel enough to call out, but consistent enough to shape how others see the person being described. Over time, it shapes how the person sees themselves if they let it. Elliot had never let it. What Priscilla did not know, what she had genuinely never thought to ask, was that the foundation of the building her company had moved into on Allen Parkway. 18 months ago, the building that had anchored their expansion into Houston's medical district and earned them a regional business award had been designed and structurally certified by Reeves Engineering Group, Elliot's firm. His calculations, his name in the filing records with the city. She had attended the ribbon cutting. She had not connected the name on the plaque to the man who made her coffee in the mornings. This is what researchers describe as the availability heuristic, the tendency to judge a person's significance based on the information most readily available about them. What was available to Priscilla was work jacket, mud-on boots, early mornings, quiet evenings, no interest in the circuit of cocktail parties she had decided constituted a meaningful life. She had assembled those pieces into a conclusion and stopped looking for evidence that might complicate it. Inside the Julia Idison building, Priscilla was working the room with the polished ease of someone who had practiced it until it felt natural. Gavin followed at a precise social distance, close enough to signal, far enough to preserve deniability. She was mid-conversation with a foundation board member named Raymond when a woman across the room caught her eye and mouthed something. Priscilla smiled back, the automatic smile. Then she turned slightly to say something to Gavin and noticed that the man standing near the entry corridor, speaking quietly with Barrett Foundation Chair Herbert Collins, was wearing a charcoal suit she almost recognized. Almost. Because the Elliot she had assembled in her mind did not belong in this room, her brain performed a small, automatic correction and moved on. At 9 o'clock, Herbert Collins stepped to the center of the room, and the crowd settled around him the way crowds settle for people who don't need volume to hold attention. Good evening. Before we begin the formal recognition program, I want to take a moment for something that is personally important to me. He paused. The Barrett Foundation exists because we believe that the built environment shapes human life in ways we rarely stop to acknowledge. The buildings we inhabit, the structures beneath our streets, the frameworks that hold our cities upright, these things are not neutral. They reflect choices. And the choices are made by specific people with specific values. He looked toward the corridor. 11 years ago, when this foundation was attempting to restore the Freedmen's Town District in 4th Ward, a project that every major structural firm in Houston had passed on as financially non-viable, one engineer submitted a proposal. He offered to complete the foundational assessment at cost, provided the city matched the investment in materials. He told me privately that his father had grown up 2 blocks from that neighborhood, and that some things were simply worth doing whether or not they penciled out. Herbert paused. That project is now a registered historic district. It generated a 47% increase in small business investment in the surrounding area over the following 8 years. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when they understand something is coming. "I would like to ask Elliot Reeves to please come forward." The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then heads turned, and from the corridor, moving through the parted crowd, with the unhurried calm of a man who has never measured his worth by other people's recognition, came a tall figure in a charcoal suit. Priscilla's champagne glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Gavin leaned slightly toward her. "Is that? Don't?" she said. Her voice was flat and very quiet. Elliot reached the front of the room. He and Herbert shook hands. The grip of two men who have worked toward the same thing for a long time without needing to talk about it publicly. Elliot turned to face the room. He let the silence hold for a moment, not for effect. He was simply in no hurry. "I'm a structural engineer," he said. "I spend most of my time looking at things other people have already looked past. Foundations, load-bearing walls, the parts of a building that nobody photographs." A few warm sounds from the crowd. 11 years ago, Herbert called me about Freedman's Town, and I said yes for the reason I say yes to most things, because the work needed doing and I was capable of doing it. He looked out at the room, not at Priscilla specifically, just out. What I didn't mention at the time was that my firm had also quietly underwritten the materials cost for the Sunnyside Community Center renovation in 2019, the structural assessment for the Kashmir Gardens flood remediation project, and the pro bono certification work on 14 affordable housing units in 3rd Ward over the past 6 years. We did not issue a press release about any of it. We did the work because the work was worth doing. The murmuring had deepened. "I'm sharing this tonight because Herbert has asked me to accept a role I've declined twice before." A brief pause. "I've agreed to join the Barrett Foundation Board as its Director of Structural Integrity Programs, a new initiative that will provide free engineering assessment and certification to community development projects across Harris County that lack access to licensed structural review." He looked down briefly, then back up. "My father poured concrete in this city for 30 years. I thought it was time I did something that honored that in a way he'd actually recognize." The applause that followed was not the reflexive kind. It built from somewhere real. Several people were standing before they seemed to have decided to. Across the room, Priscilla Thornton Reeves, who had told her mother just 3 weeks ago that Elliot simply wasn't going anywhere, sat with her champagne glass still arrested in mid-air, while the room she had been so carefully navigating reorganized itself around a truth she had never once considered looking for. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance collapse, the moment when the internal narrative a person has been maintaining becomes so violently incompatible with the actual world that the mind cannot hold both simultaneously. For the past 11 years, Priscilla's story had been, "I am the one who moves in important rooms. He manages the practical things." That story had just been quietly, completely, publicly dismantled. Gavin refilled his drink. He had nothing useful to say, which was, it turned out, a pattern. What came next, what Elliot had quietly arranged before that evening, and what Priscilla would only learn about in the weeks that followed, is the part that changed not just her understanding of her husband, but her understanding of herself. The particular kind of quiet that settled over the room after Elliot stepped back from the podium was not silence. Conversations resumed. Waitstaff circulated with second rounds. Someone near the windows was discussing a commercial development in the energy corridor that no one was genuinely interested in. But underneath all of it was a register that hadn't been there an hour before. Priscilla sat straight. Years of professional composure keeping her surface intact while something underneath began shifting in ways she could not yet name. Gavin had moved slightly away from her, a small, instinctive adjustment, the social equivalent of stepping back from something that might fall. Across the room, Elliot sat at the head table with Herbert Collins, and 2 foundation board members, speaking in the low, unhurried tones of a man who had nowhere to be but here. He was not looking in her direction. Somehow that was worse than if he had. Psychologists call what Priscilla was experiencing anticipated regret. The acute pain that comes not from what has been done to you, but from the sudden, unavoidable understanding of what you have done and cannot take back. Every dismissal across 11 years was now sitting inside a context that had entirely changed shape around it. She thought about the afternoon 2 years ago when she had told her colleague that Elliot was comfortable but not particularly interesting. She had said it without cruelty, which was, she now understood, the part that made it worse. At 9:45, Herbert returned to the podium. "I apologize for interrupting again. But there is a matter the board has asked me to address before the evening concludes." He nodded to the AV station. The projection screen behind him lit up with a document. Clean, tabular, officially formatted. Over the past 14 months, a series of billing irregularities were identified in the Foundation's Capital Projects Fund, specifically in the vendor contracts routed through our Architectural Review Committee. He paused. A forensic audit completed last month traced $160,000 in fraudulent invoice submissions to the individual responsible for coordinating vendor relations and executive project approvals. He looked up from his notes. Gavin Mercer. The name landed in the room like a structural failure, the kind that gives you 1 second of stillness before everything above it begins to move. Gavin went rigid. His expression cycled through several positions. Surprise, then the rapid calculation of someone running through options, before settling into a fixed look that was working very hard to hold its shape. Slowly, with the kind of deliberateness that turns a simple gesture into a verdict, Priscilla turned and looked at him. This was a different expression from the one she had worn an hour before. That had been shock. This was something colder and more specific, the recognition of a woman who has just understood that the man she had chosen to bring to this room had been managing her, the same way he had apparently been managing the Foundation's accounts, carefully, professionally, with very good manners. Researchers described this pattern as instrumental exploitation, forming relationships not from genuine connection, but from strategic proximity to resources and access. Gavin had not pursued Priscilla because he found her extraordinary. He had pursued her because she ran a company with procurement relationships and institutional credibility he could position himself near. The board has referred the findings to the Houston Police Department's Financial Crimes Division, Herbert said. Mr. Mercer will address these matters through the appropriate legal process. He paused for a moment, and the pause was intentional. But that is not the final thing I need to share tonight. Near the far wall, seated at one of the auxiliary tables, was a woman in her early 60s, small, composed, wearing a blue dress that had clearly been chosen with care. The face of a woman who had carried significant weight for a long time without complaint. Her name was Beverly Okafor, Priscilla's aunt, the woman who had functionally raised her after Priscilla's mother passed when Priscilla was 9 years old. Beverly had worked the cafeteria line at Jefferson Davis High School for 23 years. She had made sure Priscilla had winter coats and school supplies, and the particular kind of steady presence that an ambitious, grieving child needed in order to eventually become a capable adult. Beverly had been diagnosed with a degenerative spinal condition 3 years ago. The surgeries required were significant. Her insurance had covered roughly half. Priscilla had sent money when she could. She had told herself it was enough. In the quiet parts of herself that she did not examine closely, she had known it wasn't. Elliot returned to the microphone. He spoke without theater. 3 years ago, through a private medical expense fund coordinated with Houston Methodist Hospital, a full course of spinal surgical treatment, rehabilitation, and follow-up care was anonymously funded for a patient whose coverage had a significant gap. A pause. That patient was Beverly Okafor. Priscilla's aunt. The room did not erupt, it went still. I did not share this at the time, and I am sharing it now only because the full picture of who a person is deserves to be seen clearly. Not to place anyone in anyone's debt, but because honesty, when it finally arrives, should arrive completely. He looked across the room. Not at Priscilla. At Beverly. Beverly Okafor stood up from her table. She moved carefully, the way people move when their body has been through something real, and people stepped back without being asked. She walked to the front of the room. Elliot came down to meet her. She put her arms around him and held on for a long moment. When she finally spoke, the microphone was still live. Her voice carried to the back of the room without effort. "This man," she said. Just that. Then, quietly, "This man." She didn't need more words. Neither did anyone else. At a table near the windows, a board member who had a professional reputation for emotional containment was studying the centerpiece arrangement with unusual intensity. Priscilla was crying, not the composed variety. Both hands pressed to her face, shoulders moving, the specific unraveling of a person whose careful surface has finally, all at once, given way. Gavin Mercer had nothing to offer her. The man she had decided was what she actually deserved. Polished, socially fluent, moving in the right circles, was about to spend the next several months answering questions from people whose job is to care very precisely about where money goes. The performance, it turned out, had been the whole of him, nothing underneath. Later, near the exit, Gavin attempted something. A board member who had been with the foundation for 19 years looked at him with the specific expression of a person who has seen this particular kind of man before and is simply too tired to be surprised. "Save it," she said and walked past him. Elliot found Priscilla near the coat room. She had rebuilt her composure by sheer habit, eyes still raw underneath. She saw him coming and straightened instinctively. The old reflex. He stopped in front of her. He was not angry, not forgiving. Simply clear the way a man is clear when he has spent a long time knowing something and no longer needs to protect himself from it. "You told your mother I wasn't going anywhere," he said quietly. "You were right, I wasn't going anywhere. I was building something. Those aren't the same thing." He collected his coat. He walked out into the November night. The consequences arrived, as they usually do, not all at once but gradually, the way Houston weather shifts in winter, slowly enough that you don't notice the temperature dropping until you realize you've been cold for a while. Gavin Mercer was asked to resign from his firm within the week. His attorney recommended full cooperation with the financial investigation, which Gavin provided in the anxious, over-explaining manner of someone hoping that transparency might reduce a number that turned out to be considerably harder to reduce than anticipated. By February, he was sharing an apartment in Stafford with a college friend and managing a lifestyle that bore no resemblance to the one he had been performing. Constructed identities have no load-bearing structure. Remove the signals, the car, the address, the professional vocabulary of belonging, and there is nothing underneath to hold the shape. Priscilla knew this now. She understood, with the particular clarity that comes after humiliation, that she had mistaken Gavin's performance for substance because she had been running towards something that looked nothing like what she was afraid of becoming. Researchers call it approach avoidance confusion, when the fear of scarcity drives you toward anything that appears like abundance, regardless of whether it is real. The divorce was filed in December. Elliot did not contest the house. He moved without ceremony to a house on Ashby Street in the Montrose neighborhood. Wide porch, old live oaks along the sidewalk, neighbors who waved. It suited him considerably better than the staged perfection of their River Oaks house had ever suited either of them, though only one of them had noticed. He put the cloth cover back on the car. He went back to work. In January, Priscilla requested a meeting. It was not dramatic. She came to his office on Westheimer Road on a Thursday morning, sat across from him at the small conference table with the coffee rings. and the topographical maps of 3 active job sites spread across it, and said what she had spent 6 weeks composing. She said she was sorry for the ways she had diminished him. She said she was sorry for the 11 years of small calibrations designed to keep him sized to something she could feel superior to. She said she was sorry for Beverly, for the years she had told herself the partial help was enough and chosen not to look at the gap between what she was projecting and what she was actually doing. Elliot listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I've known for a long time." A pause. "I want you to build something real, Priscilla. I think you're capable of it. I just couldn't be the scaffolding for the version of yourself you were building." She left with nothing resolved and everything clarified, which, she was learning, was its own kind of useful. Psychologists who study post-traumatic growth, the documented phenomenon of people emerging from significant loss with measurably greater resilience and clarity than they possessed before, identify several conditions that make genuine recovery possible: a stable sense of self that predates the crisis, a network of people with real integrity, and the capacity to find honest meaning in what happened without needing to either minimize or dramatize it. Elliot had all three. He had his father's example. He had Herbert Collins and the foundation work. He had the job sites and the Tuesday mornings, and the slow, particular satisfaction of work that holds weight. And then, quietly, without announcement, he had Claire. Dr. Claire Osee was a civil engineer with the City of Houston's Infrastructure Division, 38 years old, direct in the way of people who work with physical systems and have no patience for imprecision. She had attended a Barrett Foundation planning session in March and disagreed openly with 2 of Elliot's proposed site assessments, citing updated FEMA flood zone remapping data that had been published the previous October. He had looked at her across the conference table. "You're right," he said. "I'll revise." She looked at him with the expression of someone who had prepared for an argument and found the ground removed beneath it. "That's it. The data is the data," he said. She came back to 2 more planning sessions. Then they had coffee, after the 3rd one, at a place on Montrose Boulevard where the espresso was serious, and the booths were private, and the conversation ran 45 minutes longer than either of them had planned. She didn't ask about the gala. She had heard pieces of it, the way you hear things in Houston when something notable happens. But she did not bring it up because it was context, not character. She was interested in what he was building, not what he had survived. What she saw was a man who arrived at job sites before his crew, who called the foundation volunteers by name and remembered details about their work, who, when asked what he most wanted for the structural integrity program, sat quietly for a moment and then said, "I want the buildings in neighborhoods that get ignored to be just as structurally sound as the ones that get photographed. That's the whole thing." She had looked at him across the table. "You know," she said, "most people in your position would be building a brand right now." "I know," he said. "That doesn't interest you." "Not particularly." She nodded, slowly. "That's the most interesting thing about you." This is what positive psychology research consistently documents: authentic humility. Not performed modesty. Not the strategic self-deprecation of someone who wants to be told otherwise, but the genuine absence of the need to be seen as remarkable is among the most reliable predictors of long-term psychological well-being. Not because life goes better for such people. It doesn't, necessarily. But because their sense of self does not depend on circumstances, which means circumstances cannot take it from them. Elliot Reeves had never needed anyone to confirm what he was worth. He had needed to do work that mattered. He had needed to take care of the people around him. He had needed to go home at the end of the day knowing he had been honest. That was enough. It had always been enough. Priscilla was rebuilding slowly and at real cost. Certain relationships had revealed themselves to be primarily transactional, which is a discovery most people make gradually, and Priscilla made all at once. She had begun working with a therapist in the museum district, which she had resisted for years on the grounds that she was fine, a reason therapists hear often enough to have stopped reacting to it. She was learning, at significant personal expense, the difference between ambition and the fear of poverty with ambition's name on it. Whether she would fully close that distance was a story she was still in the middle of writing. But for the first time in a long time, she was writing it with her actual hand. Beverly called Elliot every Sunday. She called him sweetheart every time, in the particular way of a woman who has been saved and knows it, and wants the person who saved her to be reminded that they are seen. He always answered. He always had time. By October, he was back on Ashby Street in the late afternoon, sitting on the porch with the coffee going cold on the railing and the live oaks going amber at the tips. Claire was beside him, reading something on her tablet, and occasionally making a small sound that meant she had found something she was going to share in a minute. He thought about his father, about what it means to build something that holds, not the structure itself, but the intention, the decision to put your hands on something real and stay with it, keep going when nobody is watching, keep going when the people around you have decided you are background. That decision, made quietly and consistently over years, is not dramatic. It does not make for a good headline. But it is, in the end, the only kind of building that actually holds. He set down his coffee. He was, he realized, genuinely happy. Not the relieved kind, not the triumphant kind, the actual kind. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The kind that has been earned, one ordinary day at a time, in ways that no one was watching and no one needed to applaud. Before you leave, think about this honestly, and leave your answer in the comments. Was Elliot right to stay quiet for as long as he did? Or is there a point where silence becomes its own kind of surrender?